History loves its great generals, the Napoleons, the Caesars, the Alexanders who conquered through brilliant tactics and overwhelming force. But what about those who won wars before they ever began? What about the leaders who turned enemies into unknowing allies, who made victory inevitable through shadows and whispers? This is the story of Shaka Zulu, the Zulu king who built the most sophisticated intelligence network in pre-colonial Africa. A man who could kill a lion with his bare hands, yet preferred to defeat enemies without them ever knowing they were being hunted. He commanded armies of 40,000 warriors, but his deadliest weapons weren't assegais or shields. They were the invisible threads of information that stretched across 1,000 miles of African kingdoms. Here's what will blow your mind. Shaka often knew what his enemies were planning before their own generals did. In early 19th century southern Africa, knowledge meant survival. One wrong move, one surprise attack, one betrayal could mean the complete annihilation of your people. In a world where neighboring tribes could turn from allies to enemies overnight, how does a young man from a despised clan transform himself into the master of an intelligence empire that would reshape an entire continent? This isn't just the story of military conquest. It's the blueprint for how information becomes the ultimate weapon, and how one man's paranoia became his greatest strength. Picture the rolling hills of KwaZulu-Natal in 1816. Hundreds of independent chiefdoms dot the landscape, each jealously guarding their cattle, their water sources, their secrets. The Ndebele to the north are expanding aggressively. The Thembu and Mpondo control crucial trade routes to the coast. Portuguese slavers prowl the borders, turning neighbor against neighbor with promises of guns and goods. This is a world where survival depends on knowing who's forming alliances, who's planning raids, who's weak enough to conquer, and who's strong enough to fear. Traditional methods of gathering intelligence, sending warriors to scout enemy territory, are slow, obvious, and often fatal. The landscape demands something revolutionary. Into this volatile world steps a 29-year-old outcast prince with an impossible dream. Not just to unite these fractured peoples, but to know everything happening in their kingdoms before they do. The moment that changes everything happens on a blood-soaked battlefield in 1816. Young Shaka, fighting for his patron Dingiswayo, watches in horror as the Ndwandwe army crushes their forces through superior intelligence. The enemy knew exactly where they would attack, exactly how many men they had, exactly when they would strike. As Dingiswayo lies dying, pierced by enemy spears, Shaka makes a vow that will reshape African history. Never again will we fight blind while our enemies see clearly. What happens next isn't just the rise of a military genius, it's the birth of an intelligence revolution that would make the Zulu name synonymous with invincibility across southern Africa. Shaka Zulu entered this world already marked by secrets and shame. His very birth in 1787 was the product of forbidden love. His father, Senzangakona, chief of the small Zulu clan, had broken cultural taboos to be with Nandi of the Langani. When their affair produced a child, both clans erupted in scandal. Shaka. The name itself was an insult. Referring to the intestinal parasite his father's people claimed caused Nandi's false pregnancy. They refused to believe their chief had fathered this bastard child. But exile teaches lessons that palaces cannot. Growing up among the Langini, then later the Mthethwa, young Shaka learned survival's first rule. Information is everything. As an outsider, he had to read faces, detect lies, understand the hidden currents of power. He watched. He listened. He remembered everything. Under the patronage of King Dingiswayo of the Mthethwa, Shaka's military genius began to emerge. But it was the brutal lesson of Dingiswayo's death that truly forged his philosophy. In 1818, the Ndwandwe chief Zwide didn't just defeat the Mthethwa through superior numbers, he outmaneuvered them through superior intelligence. Zwide's spies had infiltrated Dingiswayo's inner circle. They knew his battle plans, his troop movements, even his personal habits. When Dingiswayo rode out to parley, thinking he was meeting allies, he was walking into a trap. Zwide had his head within hours. Returning to claim leadership of his father's Zulu clan in 1816, Shaka inherited fewer than 1,500 people. Surrounded by kingdoms that commanded tens of thousands of warriors, conventional wisdom said he should align himself as a vassal to stronger powers. Instead, Shaka chose a different path, one that would require knowing more about his enemies than they knew about themselves. His first recruitment wasn't warriors, it was outcasts. The exiled, the orphaned, the culturally displaced. People like himself, who lived between worlds, who understood the art of blending in while remaining invisible. These men and women had skills that traditional warriors lacked. They could move unseen, change their accents, adopt different customs at will. Shaka's breakthrough insight was revolutionary. The best spies aren't strangers infiltrating enemy territory. They're people who already belong there but owe their loyalty elsewhere. His first major operation targeted the Langjani, his mother's people who had rejected him as a child. Rather than attack directly, Shaka sent his agents to spread carefully crafted rumors about Langani weakness, their cattle herds, their internal divisions. Within months, the Langani found themselves isolated, their traditional allies suspicious and distant. When Shaka finally moved against them in 1818, it wasn't a conquest, it was a rescue. His intelligence network had so thoroughly undermined Langani credibility that neighboring clans welcomed the Zulu intervention. The Langani warriors, demoralized and confused, surrendered almost without fighting. The victory was complete, but more importantly, it was instructive. Shaka had discovered something that would become his signature: winning wars before they began through the systematic control of information. With each absorption of defeated clans, Shaka's intelligence network grew exponentially. Former enemies became his most valuable assets. Who better to understand Thembu weaknesses than former Thembu warriors now serving in Zulu regiments? Who could more easily gather information about Ndebele movements than recent refugees from Ndebele raids? But Shaka's genius lay not just in recruitment, it was in organization. He created what military historians now recognize as the first structured intelligence service in Southern African history. Different agents served different functions. Long-term infiltrators who lived for years in target communities, short-term scouts who gathered specific tactical information, and counterintelligence specialists who fed false information to enemy spies. By 1819, Shaka commanded an army of 20,000 warriors, but his true strength lay in the thousands of additional eyes and ears scattered across the subcontinent. Traders carrying his goods to distant markets, refugees seeking shelter in enemy territories, even praised singers and traditional healers whose professions gave them access to the most guarded secrets of rival kingdoms. The Kwabe clan learned this lesson the hard way. Confident in their mountain strongholds and traditional alliances, they dismissed the growing Zulu threat. Their chief, Pakatwayo, boasted that his warriors could crush any upstart from the coastal lowlands. What Pakatwayo didn't know was that 3 of his most trusted counselors had been quietly converted to Shaka's cause months earlier, not through gold or threats, but through the more subtle currency of information. Shaka's agents had provided these men with intelligence that made them invaluable to their own chief. Early warnings of cattle raiders, knowledge of favorable trade opportunities, insights into the plans of neighboring clans. When Shaka's army finally moved against the Kwabe in 1820, they struck with precision that seemed almost supernatural. They knew exactly which passes were unguarded, which chiefs could be turned against Pakatwayo, which cattle herds could be captured to cripple Kwabe economy before the battle even began. The Kwabe resistance collapsed in 3 days. Pakatwayo himself was found hiding in a cave that, according to tribal tradition, only his bloodline knew about. One of his own loyal counselors had drawn Shaka's warriors a map. By 1820, Shaka commanded not just the most powerful army in southern Africa, but something far more dangerous, the most comprehensive intelligence network the region had ever seen. His web of informants stretched from the Drakensberg Mountains to the Indian Ocean, from the borders of modern-day Mozambique to the edges of the Kalahari Desert. But this wasn't a crude system of paid informants and coerced confessions. Shaka had created something far more sophisticated, a self-sustaining ecosystem of information that grew stronger with each conquered territory. The key was integration, not domination. When Shaka absorbed defeated clans, he didn't simply conscript their warriors. He studied their networks, their trade relationships, their cultural connections. A defeated Thembu chief might become a Zulu Induna, but more importantly, his cousin who traded with the Pondo would become an asset. His sister married to a Mpondo prince would become a source. His childhood friend, now living among the Xhosa, would become an observer. The genius lay in the layered redundancy. No single piece of critical information depended on one source. Shaka's intelligence chiefs, men like his half-brother Dingain and his cousin Mukabai, coordinated networks that cross-referenced and verified every report. If a spy reported unusual military activity in Pondo territory, at least 2 other independent sources would confirm or contradict before any action was taken. Shaka's Setaman Sandward CD. Greatest test came against Zwaid and the Ndwandwe Confederation. The same. Enemies who had destroyed his mentor, Dingiswayo. But where Dingiswayo had fallen victim to superior Ndwandwe intelligence, Shaka turned the tables completely. The campaign against the Ndwandwe in 1821 became a masterclass in information warfare. Months before the first spear was thrown, Shaka's agents began their work. They infiltrated not just Ndwandwe territory, but the territories of Zwaid's allies and vassals. They spread carefully crafted disinformation about Zulu weaknesses while gathering detailed intelligence about Ndwandwe strengths. The psychological warfare was particularly sophisticated. Shaka's agents spread stories of his supernatural powers, his ability to know what his enemies were thinking, to appear in multiple places simultaneously, to command the loyalty of the very spirits of the land. These weren't random superstitions. They were carefully targeted propaganda designed to undermine enemy morale while explaining the uncanny accuracy of Zulu intelligence. When Zwaid's massive army of 30,000 warriors finally moved against the Zulu, they found themselves fighting an enemy who seemed to read their minds. Every ambush was anticipated. Every flanking maneuver was countered. Every tactical innovation was met with a prepared response. The Battle of Gokhli Hill in 1821 showcased the devastating effectiveness of superior intelligence. Zwaid had planned a complex 3-pronged assault designed to overwhelm the smaller Zulu force through superior numbers and surprise. Instead, he found Shaka's warriors positioned perfectly to defeat each prong in sequence. But the most crushing blow came when Zwaid discovered that his own son, Sikunyane, had been secretly negotiating with Shaka for months. Not from disloyalty, but from despair. Shaka's intelligence network had so thoroughly penetrated Ndwandwe leadership that Sikunyane believed resistance was futile. The prince's betrayal wasn't actually betrayal at all. It was the logical response to overwhelming intelligence superiority. When your enemy knows your plans before you finalize them, when your own advisors seem to be working against you, when every secret becomes public knowledge, surrender begins to look like wisdom. The defeat of the Ndwandwe in 1821 triggered what historians call the Mfecane, the great dispersal that reshaped the demography of southern and eastern Africa. But what's often overlooked is how Shaka's intelligence network both caused and managed this massive population movement. As news of Ndwandwe defeat spread, dozens of smaller clans and chiefdoms faced an impossible choice: submit to Zulu hegemony or flee their ancestral lands. Most chose flight, creating a domino effect of displacement that would eventually reach as far as modern-day Tanzania and Zambia. But Shaka didn't simply watch this chaos unfold. He orchestrated it. His intelligence network tracked the movements of displaced populations, identified which groups posed potential future threats, and even guided certain migrations to serve Zulu strategic interests. The Ngoni people, fleeing Zulu expansion, carried with them not just their own cultural traditions, but also detailed knowledge of Zulu military and intelligence methods. As they conquered territory in what is now Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Tanzania, they inadvertently spread Shaka's innovations across half a continent. Meanwhile, Shaka's agents traveled with refugee populations, establishing information networks in distant territories that might one day prove valuable. When the Indabele under Mzilikazi established their kingdom in Zimbabwe, they discovered that some of their most trusted advisors maintained mysterious connections to the Zulu heartland. Shaka's most sophisticated intelligence operation targeted the Portuguese traders at Delagoa Bay, modern Maputo. These European merchants controlled access to firearms, horses, and other military technologies that could revolutionize African warfare. But they also represented a potential threat. Their involvement in the slave trade had destabilized much of the East African coast. Rather than simply raid Portuguese settlements or attempt to expel them, Shaka chose infiltration and manipulation. He sent his most culturally adaptable agents to establish trading relationships, learn Portuguese customs, and ultimately gain access to European intelligence about regional politics. The operation's masterstroke came when Shaka's agents discovered that Portuguese traders were playing African kingdoms against each other, selling weapons to multiple sides in conflicts they were secretly encouraging. Armed with this knowledge, Shaka began his own manipulation campaign. He fed false information to Portuguese traders about the military capabilities of various African kingdoms, subtly steering European trade away from potential Zulu rivals. He spread rumors about the wealth of distant kingdoms, encouraging Portuguese exploration away from Zulu territory. Most importantly, he gained advance warning of any European plans that might threaten his growing empire. By 1824, Portuguese merchants at Delagoa Bay found themselves inadvertently serving Zulu strategic interests, never quite understanding how their most profitable trade decisions always seemed to strengthen the very African power they had initially hoped to manipulate. At its height in 1825, Shaka's intelligence network was arguably the most sophisticated information-gathering system in Africa. His agents operated in over 50 different kingdoms and chiefdoms. His counterintelligence specialists had identified and turned dozens of foreign spies. His disinformation campaigns had shaped the political landscape across thousands of square miles. The network's crown jewel was its speed. Using a system of relay runners and signal fires that built upon traditional African communication methods, Shaka could receive information from the remotest corners of his intelligence web within days. News from Portuguese Mozambique might reach his capital at Bulawayo faster than it reached Portuguese officials in Lisbon. But perhaps most impressively, the network had become largely self-sustaining. New agents recruited their own sub-agents. Information flowed upward through established channels without requiring constant management from the center. The system had evolved beyond its creator's direct control into something resembling a modern intelligence service. Foreign visitors to Shaka's court, including British traders like Henry Francis Finn and Nathaniel Isaacs, consistently remarked on the king's uncanny knowledge of events happening hundreds of miles away. They attributed it to supernatural powers or exceptional natural intelligence. never suspecting the invisible army of informants that surrounded them even as they spoke. By 1827, Shaka ruled over an empire of nearly 250,000 people. His military innovations had revolutionized African warfare. His diplomatic skills had created a complex web of alliances and vassalages. But it was his intelligence network that made the Zulu kingdom truly formidable. And ultimately, it was this same network that would contribute to his downfall. The problem with creating the perfect surveillance system is that eventually, it begins to watch you too. Shaka's obsession with information had grown into something darker. The man who had once used intelligence to protect his people began using it to control them. His agents monitored not just enemy movements, but the loyalty of his own subjects. Traditional advisors found themselves reporting to intelligence chiefs who reported directly to the king, bypassing the ancient structures of Zulu governance. The transformation was gradual but devastating. Shaka's half-brothers Dingain and Bulangana, who had once served as trusted intelligence coordinators, began to feel the weight of constant surveillance. Even their private conversations were being reported to the king. Even their family relationships were being monitored for signs of disloyalty. The intelligence network that had once protected the Zulu kingdom was becoming its prison. The death of Shaka's beloved mother Nandi in 1827 marked a turning point. Consumed by grief, Shaka ordered a period of mourning so extreme that it bordered on societal self-destruction. No crops were to be planted, no milk consumed, no sexual relations permitted. Anyone who appeared insufficiently grief-stricken would be executed. But Shaka's intelligence network, designed to be ruthlessly efficient, began feeding his paranoia. Agents reported every murmur of dissent, every expression of hunger, every sign of exhaustion among his people. What had once been tools for protecting the kingdom became instruments of oppression. The king, who had revolutionized warfare through superior information, was now drowning in it. Every report brought new suspicions. Every piece of intelligence revealed new potential threats. The network that had made him invincible was making him impossible to live under. Dingain and Malangana, watching their brothers' increasing instability, began to understand a terrible truth. The intelligence network they had helped create was now being turned against them. Shaka's agents were monitoring their movements, their conversations, their relationships. The very system they had built to protect the Zulu people was becoming its greatest threat. The conspiracy against Shaka began, ironically, as a counterintelligence operation. Dingain and Malangana had to use all the techniques Shaka had taught them to evade the surveillance network they had helped construct. They recruited agents who could watch the watchers. They developed codes and signal systems that even Shaka's most trusted intelligence chiefs couldn't decipher. Faibo, irony was perfect and terrible. The princes had to destroy their brother using the very methods he had taught them. The assassination plot of September 22, 1828, was a masterpiece of intelligence tradecraft. The conspirators knew exactly which of Shaka's bodyguards could be trusted, exactly which servants would remain silent, exactly which moments the king would be most vulnerable. They had turned his own surveillance system against him with surgical precision. When Shaka fell to the assassin's spears at Kwadukuza, he reportedly asked, "Are you stabbing me, kings of the earth? You will come to an end through killing one another." His final words revealed both his understanding of what was happening and his prediction of what would follow. The king who had built the most sophisticated intelligence network in African history was ultimately destroyed by intelligence. Professionals he had trained himself, Shaka's death didn't destroy his intelligence network. It transformed it. Under Dingain's rule, the system continued to operate with deadly efficiency, though now it served different masters with different priorities. The methods Shaka had developed spread throughout southern Africa as former agents established their own kingdoms and confederations. the Ndebele under Mzilikazi, the Shangan under Soshangane, even the Sotho under Mosho Shu, all adapted elements of Shaka's intelligence innovations. The techniques that had once given the Zulu kingdom its decisive advantage became the standard practice of successful African states throughout the region. But perhaps the network's greatest victory came against its ultimate challengers, the European colonial powers. When British forces finally invaded Zululand in 1879, they found themselves facing not just disciplined warriors armed with traditional weapons, but an intelligence network that had been refined over 60 years. British commanders, accustomed to facing primitive African armies, were shocked by the quality of Zulu intelligence. Their movements were tracked, their plans anticipated, their weaknesses exploited with a sophistication that rivaled European military intelligence services. The disaster at Isandlwana, where a Zulu army annihilated a British column, was as much an intelligence victory as a military one. Shaka Senzangakona died in 1828, but the intelligence revolution he initiated continued to shape African history for generations. His innovations in information gathering, agent recruitment, and counterintelligence established principles that modern intelligence services still follow. The network's emphasis on cultural integration rather than simple espionage created a model for intelligence operations in complex, multi-ethnic environments. The system's self-sustaining structure demonstrated how information networks could survive and adapt even after their creators were gone. The psychological warfare techniques pioneered by Shaka's agents influenced military thinking far beyond the borders of southern Africa. But perhaps most importantly, Shaka's intelligence network represented something revolutionary, the first systematic African response to the information advantages that Europeans had long enjoyed. For centuries, European traders and explorers had used their superior knowledge of African political dynamics to manipulate conflicts for their own benefit. Shaka's network leveled that playing field, creating an African intelligence capacity that could match and often exceed European efforts. Yet Shaka's story also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked surveillance power. The intelligence network that protected his people ultimately oppressed them. The information systems that made him invincible also made him paranoid. The surveillance apparatus that defeated his enemies eventually turned against his family. In our modern world of digital surveillance and global intelligence networks, Shaka's legacy raises uncomfortable questions. How much security is too much? When does protection become oppression? Can any surveillance system, no matter how well-intentioned, avoid eventually watching those it was meant to protect? The Zulu king who revolutionized warfare through information control ultimately learned its most bitter lesson. In the intelligence game, everyone is both hunter and prey. The network you build to watch your enemies will eventually watch you too. Today's intelligence professionals study Shaka's methods not as historical curiosities, but as practical innovations still relevant to contemporary challenges. His techniques for building trust with agents across cultural boundaries inform modern human intelligence operations. His methods for verifying information through multiple sources establish principles still taught in intelligence academies. His understanding of how information shapes perception influences modern psychological warfare doctrine. But beyond the technical innovations, Shaka's story speaks to something deeper about the nature of power in an information age. He understood, perhaps before anyone else, that knowledge is not just a tool of war, it's the foundation of all political power. The leader who controls information controls reality itself. In our digital age, when information moves at the speed of light and surveillance technologies can track anyone anywhere, Shaka's intelligence revolution feels startlingly contemporary. The Zulu king who built his empire on knowing everything about everyone might recognize something familiar in our interconnected, monitored, information-saturated world. The question he would probably ask us is the same one his story forces us to ask ourselves. In a world where everyone can be watched, who watches the watchers? What's your take on Shaka's legacy? Was he a visionary who understood information warfare centuries ahead of his time, or a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of surveillance power? And in our modern surveillance state, have we learned the lessons of his rise and fall, or are we repeating his mistakes on a global scale? If this incredible story of intelligence innovation and political intrigue has amazed you, subscribe for more untold stories from African history that will challenge everything you thought you knew about warfare, politics, and power. What other African leaders used methods we're only now beginning to understand?